Good evening. I'm Albert Carnesale, Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to tonight's event, which is the Albert Gordon Lecture on Finance and Public Policy. Now, the Gordon Lecture was created in 1987 to recognize one of Harvard's and Wall Street's most distinguished citizens. I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Gordon, who's here with us tonight. Al, would you please stand up? Let me also recognize and welcome Elizabeth Rohatyn and Harvard President Neil Rudenstein and Angelica Rudenstein. Now, the Gordon Lecture is dedicated to improving discussion and increasing understanding of both finance and public policy, particularly in terms of the internationalization of finance. That's a quote that defines this lecture schedule. Now, this year's Gordon Lecturer is Felix Rohatyn, a senior partner of the New York investment banking house Lazard Frères and Company. A graduate of Middlebury College, Mr. Rohatyn joined Lazard Frères in 1949 and has been there ever since. Recognized as one of the world's leading investment bankers, Felix Rohatyn came to the attention of the American public in 1975 when he rescued New York City from financial chaos. As chairman of the then newly created Municipal Assistance Corporation, which was variously known as the MAC, MAC, or better yet, Big Mac. He nursed the world's financial center back to health. Not only did his MAC corporation save New York from bankruptcy, he somehow managed to turn it into a moneymaker, generating $3.5 billion, which he directed to education, mass transit, and economic development. This fall, after 18 years of service, Mr. Rohatyn resigned from MAC, stating that it wasn't a lifetime appointment, and that, quote, 18 years is an argument for term limits, close quote. But his modesty cannot hide the fact that those 18 years have been of enormous benefit to the people of New York and to the nation. His expertise extends also to international finance and international politics. In 1991, in the wake of the Cold War, when others were claiming the end of history and celebrating the triumph of capitalism over communism, he warned of a disorderly new world. Now, 2 years later, as his vision has become widely accepted, he wrote that, quote, "The domestic economy may have brought President Clinton to power. The international economy may be needed to keep him there," close quote. It's clear that our nation needs guidance to adjust to this new international economy, a world characterized by instant information, ever-changing technologies, regional trade alliances, and enormous disparities in wealth. Felix Rohatyn is one of the few people who could chart our nation's course through these troubled times. In addition to his work at Lazard Frères, Mr. Rohatyn has been rescuing the airline industry. As a member of the National Airline Commission, serving as chair of the financial subgroup, he has brought his problem-solving skills to an industry which is of critical importance to our nation's economy. He's widely admired. Even the former head of the largest union of city employees, Victor Gottbaum, who, by the way, is the father of Josh Gottbaum, a graduate of this school and an employee of Lazard Frères, who might well have viewed Mr. Rohatyn as a potential adversary, had nothing but accolades for him. In a glowing tribute, Mr. Gottbaum said that, quote, he hopes, or said he, quote, hopes and has little doubt that New Yorkers will continue to benefit from Felix's wisdom and energy. He's been a magnificent public servant, deeply loyal to his principles and to those with whom he is dealt. He's leaving MAC, but somewhere he'll find another perch. Like many of us, he really can't get his love for public policy out of his system, close quote. Those of us at the Kennedy School can think of no higher praise than a love for public policy. and of no person who deserves that praise more than Felix Rohatyn. Please join me in welcoming this investment banker, this philanthropist, this public servant, this policymaker, this problem solver, and this international thinker, the 1993 Albert H. Gordon Lecturer, Felix Rohatyn.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure. It's a privilege to be here today. It's even more of a privilege to have Al Gordon here, who is somebody that I've looked up to and admired for 40 years, and to be at Harvard and the Kennedy School. For somebody like me graduating from a small Vermont college, I think this is quite uplifting. Saving New York City was once explained to me in a rather pithy way by a friend of mine who said, when I was complaining about the time this was taking, he said, you know, saving New York is like making love to a gorilla. He said, you don't stop when you're tired, you stop when he's tired. And you learn that it takes a great deal to tire him. Today's lecture is dedicated to improved discussion and increased understanding of matters related to finance and public policy. In that context, I would like to review the relationship of the U.S. economy to the international realities of the so-called New World Order. I would like to put forward three general propositions. First, that economic growth and social stability in the developed world requires substantial and steady economic growth in the large developing countries. Secondly, that this development will require further integration of the Western economies with the rest of the world through open trade and investment policies. And third, that totally free market policies may not be the panacea that they're cracked up to be. Just as the United States is still trying to balance the benefits of free markets with the requirements of individual security and the creation of new jobs, so will other countries. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism in Europe have created a new historical reality. Never before has the competition among the world's leading powers been concentrated on economic as opposed to military and ideological realities. On the world stage today, the competition is essentially driven by economics as Western Europe, North America, Japan, China, and Southeast Asia approach the turn of the century. Last week's vote on NAFTA in the Congress and the Seattle meeting of APEC are a reflection of that situation. However, this has had another result, namely the widely accepted conclusion that the colossal economic and political failure of communism was due to the perfection of a Reagan-esque or Thatcherite version of free market capitalism. This conclusion is dangerous for two reasons. First, it isn't true. Communism collapsed mainly because of its own internal inefficiencies and contradictions, once modern communications and technology made it impossible to continue its isolation. Secondly, because it leads to the easy and unproven assumption that pure market economies can deal with technologically driven productivity growth, defense cutbacks, and foreign competition, that they can simultaneously provide high levels of employment and continued improvement in the standard of living of a large majority of the population. The danger in these assumptions is already visible in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union. The expectations raised by this prescription, superimposed on archaic systems and psychological mindsets decades behind the times, were beyond anything that could realistically be expected to come about. The best that could have been achieved would have been a disappointment. The reality in many cases turned out to be a crushing letdown. Current conditions of inflation, corruption, insecurity, and humiliation have replaced the political fear and relative economic security which characterize communist regimes. The trade-off for many is not self-evident. In my judgment, there are two reasons for these failures. First, that the prescription was wrong. For socialist countries in transition, economic shock therapy combined with immediate democratization is in most cases a prescription for economic failure and/or political reaction. Second, and equally important, is the fact that we in the West, with the most advanced economic and political systems in the world, have not yet effectively dealt with the need to equate freedom, fairness, and wealth. Liberals have consistently argued for freedom combined with fairness. The result was the redistribution of wealth and the modern welfare state. Conservatives have argued for freedom and the creation of wealth. The result has too often been significant gaps between social and economic classes, as well as a very weak safety net for those in need of assistance. Until we resolve this dilemma, economic and political solutions will be in difficulty in all democracies. It seems to me that for political stability and democracy to flourish in the world of the 21st century, three objectives have to be met. First, the big developed Western democracies, together with Japan, have to resolve the problems of structural unemployment and chronic budget deficits. The creation of adequate jobs with a future is the biggest economic and social challenge now facing the West. As a result of weak economies and flawed fiscal policies, the United States and Germany are now in particular a drain on the credit markets. They should, over time, along with the other OECD countries, become major sources of investment capital for the rest of the world. Secondly, the big developing countries, China, India, Latin America, must follow their own individual path to market economies and sustained economic growth. Many Southeast Asian countries have done so successfully. Cultural and historical factors may be as important as economic theories in determining individual countries' approach to the market economy. Social and political stability, together with currency stability, are both required to attract the necessary foreign investment and to mobilize local savings. A recent article in the Wall Street Journal by Henry Rowan suggested a possible scenario for the years 1990 to 2020, insofar as economic growth is concerned, dividing the world into rich and non-rich countries. This scenario shows that strong growth is required in the non-rich part of the world economy simply to maintain minimum acceptable growth in the developed world. Per capita growth in the OECD would be about 1.5% per annum, while the non-rich countries grow at about 3.5% per annum. Its achievement would require mutually reinforcing economic policies on an entirely new scale. The achievements of the Marshall Plan and the Bretton Woods architecture are modest in comparison. And in view of the growing importance of exports for the U.S. economy, it is easy to see that if the developing world falters, the U.S. will be in serious difficulties. It is clear that no one Western country, such as Germany, Japan, or the United States, is capable of being the locomotive to generate sufficient economic growth. It is questionable that any one region is capable of doing so. The pressures created by West Germany having to invest $10 billion per annum in East Germany, combined with continued large U.S. borrowings to finance our own budget deficits, have slowed the economies on both sides of the Atlantic. For the first time in modern history, the locomotive for the West must come from new growth in the rest of the world. Nonetheless, the United States must take the lead to achieve this objective with long-term economic and trade policies aimed at sustaining multinational economic growth. Completing the GATT and NAFTA agreements are vital aspects of that role. At home, the United States must make continued progress in the related areas of structural unemployment, budget deficits, and savings and investment. We must also redefine our foreign policy so as to give much greater emphasis to international economic integration. Like every major multinational corporation, the foreign components of economic policy are but the other side of the coin of domestic economic policy. On the domestic front, the Clinton administration has made a courageous start to reverse a decade of deficits, of increased indebtedness, and of a low savings rate. Much more will have to be done, particularly in slowing the growth of entitlement programs such as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, probably through some forms of means testing. However, providing security to the working American will have to come pari passu with deficit reduction. Universal health care is one component of that security, providing it is realistically financed. Job opportunities and financial security is a second component, and on that score, we're failing badly. The relentless downsizing of American business, together with defense cutbacks, cannot be offset just by retraining and education. These are important components, but they're inadequate, and a number of different initiatives will have to be required. Among government actions, a large-scale public works program should be undertaken, federally financed, and supplementing state and local programs. A $250 billion 10-year program would be a fraction of what is needed to bring this country's infrastructure to satisfactory condition and should be considered as a minimum first step. It could create about 1 million new jobs annually and could serve as one component of a defense conversion effort. High-speed rail, mass transit, airport construction, and many others would be a more effective use of defense contractors' capabilities than building redundant Seawolf submarines. The use of some military bases, which are presently scheduled to be closed, for CCC-type programs to train inner-city youngsters would be another benefit. The financing for such a program could be separated from the federal budget with special issues of infrastructure bonds secured by modest increases in gasoline taxes or other recurring revenues. These would pay off the bonds in 30 to 40 years and would make them eligible for investment by private and public pension funds. In addition to such a program, new private sector initiatives will have to be studied, such as shorter work weeks, earlier retirements, and tax incentives for retirees to start small businesses. The impact on productivity as well as on the budget must obviously be taken into account. But the agreement of the German unions to Volkswagen's adoption of a 4-day week must be compared with the chaos created in France by the failure of the French government to support Air France vis-à-vis its unions. The social and economic costs of long-term unemployment are usually greater than the cost of creating opportunities for those who want them. The U.S. government should also be willing to compete directly with other nations' industrial policies as they affect key American industries. An example is the case of Airbus Industry, the European Airplane Consortium, which has acquired 30% of the world's commercial aircraft market at the expense of the American aerospace industry. The estimated subsidy invested by European governments of about $30 billion over 20 to 25 years has been a spectacular success, and Airbus could well be headed for 40 to 50% of the market over time. A program should be developed between the U.S. government and the aerospace industry to assist in the development of the next generation 600 to 800 passenger super jumbo jet, as well as to the successor of the supersonic Concorde. While it is important for the U.S. to eliminate its budget deficits over time and to become an exporter of capital instead of an importer, the amounts of capital required for world development dwarf any possible Marshall Plan, either United States or even OECD-led. The original Marshall Plan consisted of about $16 billion to be dispersed over a 4-year period. This would be the equivalent of about $100 billion in today's dollars. To generate the $25 trillion of new output in the developing world over the next 25 years, as suggested by the Wall Street Journal essay, could require as much as 15 to 20 trillion of new investment. No combination of Western public and private investment can provide more than a fraction of that amount. However, Western expansionist trade and investment policies will accelerate the required internal capital generation in large developing countries. It is crystal clear that this reality requires major developing countries to establish domestic capital markets of sufficient depth, transparency, and integrity so as to encourage and mobilize domestic savings, as well as tap into the global savings pool represented by the rest of the world's capital markets. These will be heavily influenced by modern legislative reforms and financial and monetary policies of currency stability and low inflation. A global competition for capital will drive economic and political reforms, which in turn will be needed to mobilize domestic savings. In order to be able to rely mostly on private capital, developing countries must meet 2 basic requirements: a stable currency and a stable social and political environment. Runaway inflation brought about economic collapse and Nazism in post-World War I Germany. Runaway inflation today is still the biggest enemy of investments and stability. Witness the events in the former Soviet Union today. The control of inflation and the transition to a market economy argue against overnight shock therapy solutions, such as are imposed today on former communist countries. Memories are notoriously short, but World War II ended less than 50 years ago, and it would be well to review what happened then. Despite the Marshall Plan, despite the fact that European economies had experience with market economies and the technical administrative infrastructures to comprehend them, despite the German economic miracle, it took most of Europe 10 to 20 years to regain fully convertible currency and a relative level of political stability. I would argue that the task of bringing Western Europe back from the catastrophe of World War II was easier politically and economically than the task facing the former Soviet Union and possibly China today. Eastern Europe, while a daunting challenge, appears to be more manageable with the exception of Yugoslavia. West Germany has essentially taken over the responsibility for East Germany, albeit at a huge cost. Poland, despite a political setback, has strong current growth. The other countries all have histories of Western-type economies and politics, interrupted by 40 years of communism. It is hard to overemphasize the importance of opening up trade opportunities for Eastern and Central Europe. This can be done now by pressing the European community to open its markets on an accelerated timetable and its membership to Eastern and Central Europe by the end of the decade. The economic stability of Europe requires the integration of Maastricht. The social stability of Europe requires the orderly inclusion of Eastern and Central Europe into the European community through more aggressive trade and investment policies. While the prospects and the requirements for a successful transition of both the former Soviet Union and China are quite different, I remain convinced that a gradual approach to economic as well as political transition is most likely to succeed. In other words, I believe that Deng Xiaoping is more likely to succeed than Boris Yeltsin. Every major U.S. corporation that has undertaken significant restructuring programs has done so on a multi-year basis. Early retirements have been combined with programs to cushion the shock of layoffs, with definite goals set on a year-by-year basis. New York City avoided bankruptcy in the 70s with a multi-year plan along similar lines. The same approach should be applied to inefficient state enterprises, even those that lead to total shutdowns. The sacrifices required in the form of lower standards of living and higher unemployment by the quick dismantling of state enterprises and total decontrol of prices is politically unsustainable in the long run. The United States is in a poor position to argue for the compatibility of sacrifice with democracy. When a 4-cent tax on gasoline is deemed to be a terrible burden, we should be very modest when calling on others to sacrifice. There are also other models than those of Thatcherite Britain or Reaganite America for these countries to aim. Japan's spectacular post-war development took place under a one-party system and significant government guidance to the private sector. France has followed the path of a mixed economy. Similar approaches could succeed in former communist countries. Russia and some of the other members of the former Soviet Union will require special treatment. Both democratization and economic reform have gone part way and have stalled as a result of inflation, economic collapse, and political resistance of non-democratic forces. The economy will need much more time and far more outside financial and technical assistance than any of the other major countries. In the case of Russia, as well as Ukraine and Belarus, very large-scale, long-term international economic assistance programs will probably have to be set up. It is doubtful whether their technical and administrative infrastructure is adequate to manage such a program or has the ability to attract and generate sufficient private capital. A stable convertible ruble is still unattainable, but it is ultimately necessary. The international financial community, through the IMF, created additional special drawing rights which allowed members to increase their borrowings in the 1970s in order to deal with the oil crisis. This amounted to about $15 billion in today's dollars, to be spread over 7 years, and a similar approach could be taken for the former Soviet Union in order to finance a multi-year program to stabilize the currency or currencies, as the case may be. In addition, former Soviet participating countries could be encouraged to provide 10 to 20-year concessions to Western companies or consortia to acquire control of and operate some important sectors of the economy in order to accelerate transition. Control would thereafter revert to local interests. Guarantees for the protection of private property, debt repayment, and remittance would have to be provided by the local governments and supplemented by broad investment guarantees by the Western governments. I'm aware of the fact that such an approach could be described as Western neocolonialism and may be politically unacceptable. There may not be very attractive alternatives, however, and it would be well to be realistic about what is required. The Western German government's commitment to East Germany over the next 10 years will cost probably close to $100 billion, and East Germany, with less than 10% of the population of the former Soviet Union, is probably many years ahead of it in educational levels, technology, and infrastructure. The requirements of the FSU are many times the amounts invested in Germany, but its ability to receive and disperse them are inadequate. This will require both time and significant foreign participation. The grand bargain proposed by Harvard's Graham Allison and Robert Blackwell was an idea ahead of its time. Some version of the grand bargain will, however, be required. China is a different case. It has allowed gradual economic liberalization, beginning with agriculture. It has maintained up to recently a relatively stable currency while maintaining a politically authoritarian system. It has had the support of large amounts of capital and know-how provided by overseas Chinese, as well as foreign trade surpluses and other inflows. So far, the result has been an economic boom, huge inflows of capital, and in certain regions, significant advances to a market economy at spectacular growth rates. However, the lack of a modern administrative, legal, and credit structure, an inadequate public infrastructure, and some of the more negative aspects of rapid economic development, such as rampant speculation, corruption, crime, and increased inflation, leave the question of the future of China still unanswered. Huge differences exist in the pace and level of economic transition between the coastal regions and the rest of the country, and between urban and rural areas. The challenge to the Chinese government is to get administrative and financial mechanisms in place that enable national policies to be carried out effectively. Equally important is the development of a capital market of sufficient size to raise the huge sums necessary, both domestically and abroad, to meet China's needs. Direct investment will not be sufficient without the creation of such a market, and an independent and responsible Chinese central bank is integral to such development. Our economic relationship with Japan is beginning to change as China becomes a more important factor, and as Japan's own economic and political problems force a reassessment of their own situation. The Clinton administration is absolutely correct in attempting to obtain a measurable reduction in our balance of trade deficit with Japan based on measuring sectoral activity. Equally important, however, is to push Japan to open its doors to U.S. direct investment as broadly as we've maintained open investment on the part of Europe and Japan. Japan maintains an almost impenetrable net of bank, insurance, and industrial cross-ownership and control, which makes direct foreign investment very difficult, if not impossible. Mexico and the rest of Latin America will be heavily dependent on the success and the extension of NAFTA. The creation of a total American market, reaching from Canada to the tip of Argentina, is clearly in our interest, as well as those of Canada and all of Latin America. NAFTA is a key first step and was a critical and courageous win for the Clinton administration. At the same time, we should make it clear that NAFTA and the ultimate creation of a continental American market is not exclusive of other regions. Powerful economic forces will push China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and possibly Japan to create an economic trading zone that could someday be exclusive of the West. Germany, if European Union fails, could drift towards similar arrangements, with Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and possibly Ukraine. Such developments would be profoundly inimical to our interests. However, we need not embrace Asia at the expense of Europe, as was recently hinted at the Seattle APEC meeting. Common values, histories, and languages still play an important role in the world. President Clinton must continue his fight against protectionism throughout the West by providing a bridge instead of a moat between Europe and Asia. Which brings me back to the U.S. economy and the U.S. role in the world. I stated at the beginning of this lecture my belief that we had yet to prove that free market capitalism can successfully close the triangle of political freedom, the creation of wealth, and the fairness of its distribution. It may be that this is impossible, and that the price of political freedom and the creation of wealth requires the sacrifice of job and income security for significant parts of the population. This is Reaganism and Thatcherism at its purest, and more or less describes the recent attitude, implicit rather than explicit, of most Western governments, including the United States. This is not good enough, and recent statements by President Clinton and Senator Bill Bradley, pointing to the need for security by the average American, underline this fact. Before we push other countries too hard with respect to the appropriate role of government and to what models they should follow, we had better be further along in providing satisfactory answers to these problems ourselves while closing our own budget deficits and stimulating our economy. It is also clear that progress on the domestic economy is necessary for the process of international integration. A stronger U.S. economy would have removed the threat to NAFTA caused by fears of domestic unemployment. A stronger French economy would reduce the threat to GATT created by internal pressures on the French government. A recent article in Business Week described General Electric's strategy for the 21st century as being focused on aggressive investment in China, India, and Mexico. The chairman of GE, Jack Welch, is quoted as saying, "If I'm wrong, we'll lose 1 or 2 billion. If I'm right, we'll own the 21st century." I think he's making the right bet. The future of our economy is organically and permanently tied to the developing world, and the process of integration must accelerate. Economic integration can allow for different political and social paths to be followed as countries experiment with what is best for them. Access to large amounts of development capital will, however, be central to every country's performance, and the competition for that capital will be fierce. The world may be a lot safer today than it was before the Berlin Wall fell. I say maybe because safety is relative and lots of dangers remain. What is certain is that safety can be buttressed by economic growth, and that American growth is heavily dependent on the rest of the world. Our ability to solve our own economic and social problems is heavily dependent on our leadership in helping other countries to solve theirs. The reverse, however, is equally true. These are two sides of the same coin. Thank you very much.
We have time for some questions. There were 2 microphones here. It would be helpful if people would step to the microphone. Don't be bashful. Step to the microphone to ask your questions and identify yourselves before asking them. As always, the MC always has to be prepared to ask the first question while others get ready to ask theirs. Mine is has to do with political feasibility. If what are the signs that there will be either private or public capital available for Russia, for example, or Belarus, or Ukraine, or for that matter, for the developing countries, which you say are essential if our economy is to make it. We have to develop markets there.
Well, I think I indicated that I think that there will be no private capital in any amounts available for the former Soviet Union without a large program involving Western government guarantees for private investment in some form. And I try to suggest that what may be inelegant is to look at the development of the former Soviet economy almost along the lines that were taken to develop Middle Eastern oil in the 20s and 30s by essentially giving concessions to Western companies and Western groups to take that development in charge for a period of 10 or 20 years and then turn it back over to the local countries after it's happened. But I don't see this happening simply as is without a miracle. I think other countries, it may be different. I think in Eastern Europe, in Czechoslovakia, in Czechia, or in Slovakia, or in Hungary, there will be private markets that have developed and that are developing. And in Southeast Asia, it's a whole different story. But in the former Soviet Union, I don't see it at all. And I think unless we do something, I think the dangers of explosions and of real turmoil, and at a minimum unrest, and at the other extreme, much more serious problems are going to be facing us, including at some point a suggestion in this country that we have to increase our defense spending dramatically because of unrest in those countries. And I think it's much cheaper, better, and more efficient to do it early and to do it through some private sector guarantees.
My name is Michael Moynihan. I'm a mid-career student at the Kennedy School. And I would like to ask you, it appears that the U.S. is beginning what may be a fairly sustained recovery. And alternatively, Japan is having a lot of trouble. Their stock market just dropped 4%, and it's down about 20% in the last month. Do you see any risk to the U.S. recovery from the problems in Japan?
Well, you remember the last time these markets seemed disconnected when we had our great collapse in '87. The Japanese markets didn't seem to react that dramatically, and when the Japanese markets dropped dramatically a few years ago, we seemed to be reasonably protected from that. Look, I think there's always I think the risk here is to the Japanese economy, and as a result of problems with the Japanese economy, to the essential problems of Western growth. And as I tried to indicate earlier, whichever way what Japan is going through now is essentially their banks are going through our S&L problem. I mean, they just didn't write off their bad loans as early as we did, and they tried to prop all this up, and now it's coming home to roost. But the overall problem is that I don't believe that if you take Western Europe, the United States, and Japan, even at best, there is enough growth in these very mature economies, even if we recover to 3%, 3.5%, to deal with the social problems and structural unemployment and technological unemployment. And the economic activity that has to be generated is not enough in the West, I don't think. And that's why I think that you really have to look at the impact of China, India, Latin America to make a difference. But obviously, if tomorrow the Japanese market were to go down by 5,000 points, I think you'd feel it here. You'd have some kind of a reaction. I don't think the American banks, for instance, are terribly exposed to the Japanese banking system as they were a few years ago. So there are no real circuit breakers in the world's capital markets anymore, but there seems to have been some cushion between ours and the Japanese the last couple of times around.
As a potentially positive, something that might help the economy, do you see the information highway as generating much growth in years ahead?
Well, it's generating much ink at this point. Look, clearly this is a huge, the technology that's racing together of media, communications, entertainment, and telephones, for instance, which is a global race, is going to generate huge investments. It's also going to destroy a lot of things. It's very hard, there are always minuses to these big new pluses. But it should be a big plus. The development, which is a global development, should generate huge amounts of investment. But as somebody who represents Paramount at this time, as somebody who's represented McCaw Cellular in their merger with AT&T, we have a lively interest in this exercise. But as always, there are going to be excesses, and the romance of the superhighway of information maybe getting into the securities markets in terms of valuations. And the promise maybe looks a little bit nearer than the realization. I mean, for instance, this notion that there are going to be 500 channels on cable for you to pick from, whether there is enough economic substance to sustain 200 channels, 250 channels, and whether you're going to have the patience to go through the exercise to pick and choose. I mean, those are still open questions.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Reutin, I have two quotes that I found from you. Tell me if they are not from you, but I will read them to you, and I would like you to expand on it and maybe tell us about the solution.
Would you
Because,
identify yourself?
yeah, my name is Gaudens Asenza. I'm a student at the Kennedy School in a 2-year program. So the first one is the following. You say, quote, "Financial deregulation, technology, and world markets, and the fact that money just caroms around the world at infinite speeds has made it possible for people to speculate on a huge scale with very little money of their own committed to it. Since the returns on those kinds of speculation were always bigger than if you really had to go to work and build a factory or develop a product, the so-called financial industry became the biggest growth industry in the world."
That's not a bad quote, you know. I'm pretty pleased with that. I think that's all right. I mean, what can I tell you? I think that's correct. I think that's correct. And I do mean, look, and I must tell you, I still use a slide rule, so I'm way out of fashion, and I don't understand derivatives, and I wouldn't do them if I understood them. But I do believe that what we call now, you know, product development in the financial industry, which are these derivatives and swaps and all these off-balance sheet transactions that presumably are supposed to take away risk, but really are not always laying it off on somebody else, is I think a very troublesome thing. At the same time, you see that you can, I mean, the rewards of speculation in foreign exchange became obvious to the world when George Soros was on the cover of every magazine for having busted the Bank of England. So you do have these immediate things that you see, and the leverage created by these transactions is just enormous. And I find that that's really the inflation that's occurred, which is in financial assets, because we're not building real assets, is one of the weaknesses of the system. But I must tell you, I'm not proud of all my quotes, but this isn't bad.
But you've got a second one, right?
Yeah, I have a second one.
Why don't we stop after the first one?
The second one goes as follows. It says, "People would always rather make $1 billion. Prior to this decade, the only way to really make huge amounts of money was to be essentially very productive. In the 80s, you didn't have to be. You could make $1 billion, as some people did, simply by shuffling pieces of paper or by helping a raider take over a company and break it up." I would like to comment on it, you to comment on it, especially in a sense what you've had in the lecture, that we have little economic growth and that maybe all this speculation going on is one of the factors of little economic growth.
Well, I think that's correct. I think that the kind of things that I was talking about, first of all, was very unproductive. A lot of it was used to break up companies and instead of creating new employment, essentially reduce employment by in effect running companies to pay off debt. And secondly, we created huge amounts of very bad debts as we went through this exercise, and whether it was writing off 150 billion on savings and loans or having the banks write off huge amounts of money on their bad loans to real estate investments or other corporately high leveraged investments, that creates a contraction. I mean, absorbing our bad debts of the 80s was a very contractionary thing. Having to pay 150 billion to bail out the S&Ls was a disastrous thing, and it was a regional disaster because we were actually shifting money from the Northeast and the Midwest to the Southwest and the South, where most of these S&Ls had lost their biggest investments. So I'm actually pretty pleased with that second quote now that you mention it. Thank you for mentioning it. And that's really what Japan is beginning to go through at this point, as they start amortizing the huge amounts of bad loans that they have throughout their banking system, because they did exactly the same thing we did, only they did it sort of more privately because there is no SEC there to really require financial statements that are transparent, and because of these very interlocking system of investments. But I certainly stand by that statement, and I think every effort should be made through the tax laws and otherwise to encourage physical and R&D and development investment as opposed to financial speculation.
My name is Jeff Yolen, and I'm a joint degree student with the Business School and the Kennedy School. My question relates to your experience with the Municipal Assistance Corporation, and I'm wondering if you see any major parallels between the underdevelopment of our own domestic cities and some of the problems in the developing countries that you've talked about.
The problems of our cities are, I would say, somewhat different from the, well, maybe not now that you, I don't see the parallels so much between the underdeveloped countries and the city, but I do see a correlation between the 19th century America and today in huge disparities of income and opportunity between inner city children, between inner city minorities, and between the other half of the cities, which is wealthy, well-to-do, has opportunities. And there is really no bridge between the two. And the problem psychologically for most inner city children, for instance, who look ahead and they look at a family structure that's non-existent, at a school system that is deficient, and nothing at all at the other end of the pipeline, if you will, in terms of jobs, in terms of the ability. They're very realistic, these kids. They know that for them, there's no hope out there without a lot of additional assistance. And that, to me, is the biggest challenge of the cities today. Now you have problems that compress this, which are drugs and crime and AIDS and homelessness, and the technical revolution, which is squeezing down the employment opportunities, especially in the service industries. That's somewhat different than the problems of I don't know, Brazil or an African country. But it's more explosive when it's put within a country as wealthy as the United States. Just as communist countries blew up because people in Eastern Europe could see on television what was happening in the West, people in the inner city can see what's happening in the rest of the country. And you can't really tolerate interminably not only the gap between, but that the gap is increasing. And that there's nothing at this point that gives anybody confidence that a real bridge is built between the inner city and the rest of the country.
Mr. Rohit, and my name is Hari Iyer. I'm a first-year student at the business school. My question related to the scarcity of capital. And I mean, what you had said was that growth in the West is very intrinsically tied to growth in developing countries. And whatever growth rates you had mentioned assume some level of investment and spending. And I just didn't see, having tried to raise money for a lot of these developing countries, and just knowing what the infrastructure needs are, whatever the amount of money you said was required to rebuild American infrastructure, you'd have to take a multiple of it to rebuild Indian infrastructure or Chinese infrastructure. And I just couldn't see that for the next 10 or 15 years, where the money was going to come from to finance all of this. I can't see the shrinking budgets in developed countries or higher savings rates being able to pay for this. I mean, India's got a savings rate of 22%, and even that is like nowhere near what it needs to even finance the power industry there. So I just wanted a little more clarity from you on that.
I wish I could give it to you. I'm not at all sanguine that there is going to be enough capital to do this. That's why I said I thought there would be a really savage competition for capital over the next 20 years. And the people who are going to win that race are countries that can create, that have political and social and economic policies that are forward-looking enough and stable enough to create internal capital markets of sufficient size, not only to mobilize their own savings, but to attract foreign capital from other countries. And the numbers that, at least I have no, these numbers are anybody's guess, but I believe these numbers are staggering, and I think it's going to be very difficult. But without internal generation of capital and savings, it's clear that it can't come from external capital or direct investment, because there isn't going to be enough of it.
In that respect, wouldn't you think, I mean, when you said that China was in a worse position than Eastern Europe, don't you think that China is actually in a better position than Eastern Europe?
I didn't say China was I think China is a much better position than Eastern Europe. I said I think that China, conceptually, bringing China into the 21st century, not only economically, but politically, socially, and administratively, may be as big a challenge in certain respects as bringing Western Europe back from World War II. But I certainly don't think that China is worse off than the former Soviet Union, not at all.
Good evening. My name is John Krofchek. I'm wondering how you see the meaning of political liberty evolving in response to increasing international integration of economies, and with that increased mobility of capital.
You're asking about the equation of political liberty and economic markets, essentially?
Or how if you have any thoughts on how the dimensions of political liberty may change as the dimensions of national sovereignty change in the light of international economic
integration. Let me try to put it to you somewhat differently. I believe very strongly that modern economies, more or less market-driven, because as I indicated to you, I'm not a total fan of the totally free market. But modern economies, essentially market-driven, ultimately require democratic political systems. That doesn't mean that I believe that overnight you can create a democratic political system at the same time as you open up a command economy to market forces. Because as I said, I think it's very difficult for democracies to tolerate sacrifice, economic sacrifice, especially in an age when television permits every politician to promise everybody anything. Therefore, I think some control over the political system has to survive for some time, as these very painful actions that are taken to open up an economy, to dismantle government-owned enterprises, may have to take place. But ultimately, the democracy will be driven by the economic institutions that require that political freedom to operate. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, and I'm not very happy with my thinking on it, but that's the best I can do.
How about on the flip side, say, for example, in the United States economy, one small example would be the decreasing influence of the U.S. government on the money supply, and decreasing usefulness of monetary policy.
Well, you see, that's really not, to me, the failure of the shortcoming of democracy in the United States is the almost theological inability to increase the price of gasoline because a gas tax is, there are two things that are sacred in this country, are guns and gas for some reason. And our public infrastructure is probably $2 trillion underinvested at this point. And if we only would raise gasoline prices by 25 to 50 cents over the next 5 to 10 years, we could finance $1 trillion public works investment over the next 10 years, put everybody to work, close our deficit, etc. But this government, the best it could do, mobilizing the entire country and the powers of the government, was 4 measly, puny cents. And I find that impossible to understand. And I think, to me, that's whether controlling the money supply, opening up the Fed's board meetings to public scrutiny, et cetera, is less of a, is to me less of a problem than this notion that we're an overtaxed economy when we're not, when we have total aspects of the economy that are grossly subsidized and grossly undertaxed, and that we can't make people understand that the choice for us is not paying a tax or not paying a tax, but it's paying a tax or having a lousy school, or paying a tax or paying a different type of tax, or paying a tax and not having a bridge. This is a society that doesn't understand choice. And, well, that's a whole different subject. Thank you.
We're trying to do these 3 questions so you can brief.
My name is Keith Morrison.
I'll try
I'm
to keep my answers.
Student here at the Kennedy School. And earlier this year, President Clinton proposed a so-called job summit following up on the G7 summit. However, this summit was canceled due to many reasons, among them a lack of interest, seeming incompatibility between the U.S. economy and the Western European and Japanese economies, and a feeling that the summit just would have been a waste of time. Do you agree with that? And if you don't, if you were running that summit, how would you have made it work?
Well, first of all, I don't agree with that. I think probably more than ever, we really need to examine any idea that is available to see how we can not only generate employment, but make the employment that's available to as many people as possible. That's why I think that even though there are a lot of problems with it, you really should take a look at the 4-day week as it's being looked at in France and Germany. I know there are a lot of, everybody here can tell me all the reasons we shouldn't do the 4-day week. On the other hand, maybe it's worth looking at, scheduling people differently, doing things differently. We should look at earlier retirements and motivating people to have second careers after they retire by giving them tax benefits to start small businesses. We should look at public works as a way of generating employment. As I said, I believe that the creation of real employment is the biggest challenge to the West for the next 20 years. And I think we damn well should have a summit.
Just following up on what you just said, you had suggested that the government... my name is Ali Maki, and I'm an alumni of the Kennedy School. But you had suggested that the government spent to the tune of $250 billion on public works and the like. And you had suggested separating the funding of that investment from the federal budget.
Right.
And maybe issuing bonds backed by the gasoline tax. Aren't you concerned about the large number of federal unfunded liabilities like Ginnie Mae, Sallie Mae, and so on? And wouldn't this just add to that list of unfunded liabilities that the federal government is now exposed to? And secondly...
well, can I answer that first?
Okay.
The answer is it would not, because the amount of the gas tax would fully service and pay off the bonds over their life, just as we did in New York City with the Municipal Assistance Corporation, where we started from scratch in '75. We built up our borrowing to $10 billion in '84 with a dedicated revenue stream. Our borrowing is now down to $5.5 billion, and by 2008, it will be down to 0, which is kind of a unique experience in the history of American public institutions. But no, it would not. If you have a a trust fund and a dedicated stream of revenue and bonds that will be paid off by the revenue, you're not adding a cent to the unfunded liability.
But in a related question then, if you had this sort of tax, have you done any calculations on your, in advocating this to see if the contractionary effect of a tax increase would not offset this increase in public investment that you're advocating?
As a matter of fact, we have. And to finance $250 billion of public works over 10 years with 40-year bonds and a 20% local share of investment carried by states would require an increase of 2 cents per year for 5 years in gasoline taxes. So you're taking $2 billion out of the economy because each penny is $1 billion, but you're spending $25 billion in new construction, so you have a net stimulative effect of about $23 billion. And over the life of the program, which is $250 billion over 10 years, you have a net stimulative effect of maybe $150 billion. It's very small. Actually, that's why I say it's puny in terms of the size of our economy. But if you start off with $250 billion, maybe you'll end up with 500, 750 trillion.
Maybe permitted one more question?
I think 2 per customer is enough. Thank you.
My name is Damon Silvers. I'm a joint degree candidate in law school and the business school. I was curious, in your proposal for the $250 billion in infrastructure that the people before have asked about, one of your motivations seems to be to decouple working Americans' perception of globalization and economic change as equaling pain and suffering for them, and to sort of take the fire out of the kind of fight we just saw last week on NAFTA. And that seems great to me. And I was curious what political path you saw for such proposals in the light of the disappointment you just mentioned about the gas tax and the general failure of Clinton's early proposals on economic stimulus.
Well, that's a very good question. To me, the political path to this is the administrations and the Democratic parties' probable requirement to join up with the unions at some point. And clearly the major unions would be very supportive of this. Secondly, I believe that job creation sooner or later will be the driving force of American politics, more than health care, more than crime. And those two things seem to me to be a powerful stimulus. And I believe that that should be true on a bipartisan basis. I mean, these things are going to help local governments, and I would think you could get Republican mayors and Republican governors to support this kind of an approach as easily as you can get Democrats. So what you have to do is to kind of isolate the energy-producing states to some extent. But a lot of them have defense contractors that are going down and that might get some help here. It just doesn't seem to require any kind of heroics to get on television and tell the American people that for 2 cents on gasoline you can create maybe 1 million jobs a year. I mean, if the country can't stand that, then you should close the school, you should close the country. Because then there's really then you can't convince people to do anything, then it's grotesque. And then democracy will have failed because you can't even then explain to people that it's in their own self-interest to spend 2 cents on gasoline, which is probably $20 a year or 15 or some ludicrous amount. Again, it's not a very good answer.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, let me thank all of you. Let me thank Al Gordon for making this possible, and thank Felix Ratton for fulfilling the promise. Thanks all very much.